Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of our discussion today about science in artistic form, particularly with so many renowned artists attending to this arena of investigation here with us today. I came to this topic through my own research on contemporary artists' engagements with historical natural history. My research has found me, as I'm sure it has these artists, doing all kinds of really fun things, from tracking bears in Wyoming and in Arkansas with game and fish, to climbing trees and hunting mushrooms in Pennsylvania, to watching in amazement as my art history class built a jetty habitat for fish and turtles on a farm in Arkansas last year. This panel, needless to say, is right up my alley, and so for purely selfish reasons, I look forward to learning more about each of your projects and hearing your thoughts about the relationship of art and science, and more specifically, nature today. Artists have long viewed the visual world through a scientific lens. Many are familiar with the Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci's observations of the natural world and explorations of flight, detailed in his voluminous notebooks, as well as the Dutch artist Johannes Vermeer's use of optics. During the Enlightenment, the British artist Joseph Wright of Derby depicted the marvels of scientific experiments and instruction, as with his paintings of a family observing a bird in an air pump subjected to different oxygen levels, and a lecture on the workings of an orrery. In the 19th century, the French artist Daguerre embraced the new technology of photography, and Georges Seurat addressed the human perception of light and color in his paintings of French people in states of outdoor leisure. In the 20th century, mass reproduction, the discovery of the structure of DNA, and the invention of the atomic bomb spurred new artistic engagements with the world of science that would transform our vision of what art could be and challenge our ideas about what it means to be human. The 21st century began with the artist Eduardo Kack's glowing bunny Alba, who grew from an albino rabbit embryo injected with a fluorescent jellyfish protein. The transgenic crossing, a marvel of science, nature, and art, took genetic cloning out of the hands of scientists and bestowed the magic of genetic mutation upon artists. Artists have continued to challenge the boundaries of art and science, and while this panel by no means attempts to account for the long history of art-science entwinements, it acknowledges this history to varying degrees and reckons with it in the production of new artistic practices, processes, and forms. Each artist here today will speak to the ways her own work employs science, primarily the relationship of nature and the natural sciences, to her artistic practice. I would like to begin each presentation by just saying a few words about each artist. Crystal Bridges is pleased to have Isabella Kirkland's Emergent from 2011 on display in State of the Art. From Sausalito, California, Kirkland offers us a chromatically rich painting of a mid-elevation tropical rainforest habitat, which includes recently discovered species from Colombia, India, and Brazil, among other places. Her work emphasizes the wonders of biodiversity while attending to the stark realities of its ecological decimation. Isabella, would you like to?
Thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate being here. It was a great place, and I'm wondering how to get my first slide up there. There it is. This is Vermivora bachmani. It was Audubon's favorite songbird, now extinct. If you've seen my painting, you'll know that I have a fetish for detail, and always have had. But what compels me most to make artwork is the urgent need for humans to modify their behavior before we completely destroy the systems that give us fresh air and water. So I've tried to marry those two concerns by using 17th century Dutch style, with their sort of objective realness that's in their paintings, and to use it for my own political ends. This is a gorgetted puff leg. Its name is Eriocnomus Isabella. I had to include that painting just for obvious reasons. It was found in Colombia in 2007, so everything in the whole Nova series is new to Western science since about the year 2000. To paint a species accurately, I try to see, photograph, measure, specimens or their living relatives before I paint them, because the texture of a bill or the way a feather pattern goes together is not in the scientific description, which I usually read. And actually, seeing Heed's photograph of the butterfly, morpho butterfly, helped me figure out exactly how he did it. And I've been putting individual scales on the butterflies in my paintings with a pin. And he used the texture of the canvas, but I could never tell that until I saw the original. This painting is called Forest Floor. It's 3 feet by 6 feet. Everything in it is at life size, and it was the first of my Nova series. There's a begonia on the right here that's called Begonia lazat. Lazat means delicious in Malay, so that species was not new to them because they were already eating it. That's why I added the caveat, new to Western science. With all the work that I've been doing on the whole Taxa Nova series of paintings I've been working on, I really set out to make highly durable artworks whose content is both potent, recognizable, and analog. As you know, if you haven't updated your operating system lately, you have to keep up with it. I'm counting on people's lust for beautiful objects to ensure the survival of my paintings. I really want this snapshot of our thinking about man's relationship to the natural world to survive, as the Dutch paintings have, and I'm counting on the beauty to be the vehicle. This is a chinchilla rat. It was only known from mummies. It was found completely by accident in 2001. We think the Inca used them as pets. They're kind of like guinea pigs. I ended up having to email almost every single scientist to get their own photographs of these things. There are very few specimens taken by natural history museums any longer. So it became a very large email project. This is a Bukidnon woodcock. We have an American woodcock here. I believe they're in the fair state of Arkansas. But this is a great example of co-evolution. So it's a duff hunting plant. They root around in the duff, and it evolved in the Philippines in a separate evolution, often called co-evolution, which happens to be a magazine I used to work for. Founded by Stuart Brand. Woodcock are really cool. They were the first thing I ever taxidermed. I did a pair for my dad, and they actually have a prehensile bill. There's tons of nerve endings in the bill, and they actually can sense movement in the ground. This is a painting called Understory. It was the sort of second layer in my imaginary rainforest in the Nova cycle. Everything's at life size, so they're in the correct relationship to each other. The average museum goer spends about 7 seconds in front of a work of art. So one of my goals has been to slow people down. If you sit in a deer stand for long enough, you notice a lot of things you wouldn't notice if you were just sitting there for 5 minutes. I try to slow people down with stories and with lots of detail and with a map to the species. Oops, sorry. This is some people who've become friends, like many of the scientists I've worked with, Lena Strew and Jason Grant. They discovered a plant called Macrocarpia apparata in Ecuador in 2002. They saw this thing that sort of loomed up out of the mist, and they thought it apparated like Harry Potter. And so they said I could borrow a specimen from them, so I thought, that's great, and they COD'd it to me. And I thought they were in Ohio, but they were in Switzerland. It ended up costing me about $400. So this is the plant, the real plant on the left. Yeah, left. And a model I had to build of it on the right. It's a weird plant. It grows with a single bowl up the middle, and then alternating V's at 90-degree angles. So in order to draw it, I had to build a scale model of it. I wanted to use a tree as the main, this tree as the main image in the understory painting, because it would represent both the tree of life and sort of the clades that scientists use to parse the evolution of species. This is a detail from Understory. On the left is this is called Draco palawanensis. It's actually a flying lizard or gliding lizard. And I actually saw an eyelash viper in Costa Rica silhouetted on a leaf just like that, so I wanted to memorialize that moment. And a lemur found in New Guinea. You know, everything is so complicated and so rich and embedded together and twined together that the tree that this lemur sleeps in relies on a particular kind of microbe that lives in this lemur's gut. So I think the more we learn about how intricately woven together ecosystems are, the more we realize our own responsibility. This is canopy, the third layer in my imaginary rainforest. This odd little guy down here is the goldenpalace.com TT monkey, the only species we know of that has an URL in its name. They raffled off the naming rights, and that's who won. I'm sorry, I lost my place. In this painting, I kept trying to say, I'm just trying to paint the air, you know, and it's really hard. Oops. These are a couple of details from Canopy. This is a forest falcon on the left. I think of my work both as democratic and as subtly subversive, because anyone can walk away with whatever they want from it. If you just want to enjoy it for a moment, that's fine. But I do try to nudge people toward a greater acceptance of their place in the world, of their responsibility to everything else that lives. Another detail from Canopy. I had this mouse actually is an entirely new family of animals, very deep in the lineage of rodents. And all these little orchids, I met a lovely man named Carl Luer. He's in his 90s. He's spent his entire life working on pleurophthalid orchids, many of them no bigger plant and flower than your thumbnail. The great joy of my work is working with scientists, and I like to try to communicate that enthusiasm. This is a typical picture of what I work from. I've been in science museums all over the world now, taking photographs and measurements and making drawings. This is a snail-eating snake that's actually an emergent. You know, pickled snakes and dried bugs, that's all we have left of some species. We have that, and we have remorse. This is a drawing of one of the early stage drawings of emergent. I use tissue paper, tracing paper, and sort of keep building and building the drawing, and then I transfer it directly by redrawing it with contact paper, like carbon paper. And then my husband says, well, after that, it's just paint by number. This is but it's the fourth layer in the forest, in a rainforest, and most people don't think about that, but one of the reasons I wanted to do that layer is because you can see that there's sequential blooming. And if you take all of one kind of tree blooms at one time, and then all of the same kind of tree blooms at a different time. This is a painting I just finished, 206 species of nudibranchs, really brightly colored, but they don't even have eyes, so why are they that bright? This is, I'm just going to show you quickly the taxa paintings, and really just, I don't want to preach. I don't mean to communicate anything except a spirit of stewardship for the rest of nature. And I want people to recognize that what they do every day has an effect somewhere in the world. So it's the whole reason for doing the work I do.
Thanks, Isabella. Our next artist, Monica Martinez, comes to us from Phoenix, Arizona, and provides us with a detailed and colorful painting of a male torso from her series, Nothing in Stasis. Often taking a year to complete each work, Martinez's painstaking studies provide anatomical specificity while still embracing the connection between mind, body, and spirit. Her holistic approach suggests a science of equal parts empiricism, philosophy, and metaphysics. Monica?
Hello. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, Monica Martinez. Up on the right-hand corner, I have a quote from T.S. Eliot. And I actually scribbled this on a sheet of paper when I was in graduate school. And I still have that little paper tag to my studio wall. So that's there to remind me of what I'm talking about and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then it's there to inform you. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. I see my work as exploration. And where I begin is with me. And then full circle, I come back to me. But in that process, I'm out in the world. I'm connecting with people, with bodies, animals, nature. And I always begin most every work with who am I, what is this world, and what is my relationship to it. These thoughts are mulling around my head all the time. And I'm either working on one or the other or all three. And this is how I connect my work to the environment. This is the image that Crystal Bridges has in the show right now. It's a male torso, anterior view, and that's what the work is called. I'm looking at medical illustrations, and I'm studying the body. I'm a long-distance runner, and I practice yoga. I've been running since I was 16. And I really thought that I knew the body. I thought I knew what it was like to be in the body. And really, only since I've started this series do I understand what it really means to be in my body. And my hope is that I get your attention and make you curious and interested to be in your body. If you separate the mind from the body, one becomes destructive. So it's important that we keep that connection. This is a male. And here's the female, and it's the same title, female, torso, anterior view. Initially, when I began my series, the series is called Nothing in Stasis. When I began the series, I was going to set up a male and a female. That might be changing, we'll see. But I'm working with ideas of the feminine and ideas of the masculine. So those qualities appear in different forms. I thought of simply male and female. So every image was to have a partner. Each image will have within it the masculine and the feminine qualities. So I'm looking at linear, rational, masculine qualities, organic, fluid, those are feminine qualities. Each image will contain those ideas. And it's not about one outweighing the other, it's about a balance. When I began this series, I was reading a book called New Self, New World, Shepherd. And he talks about how we went from a matriarchy to a patriarchy. And he looks at indigenous cultures and their connection to the world that surrounded them. And that's changed. He doesn't decide that we need to bring back a matriarchal culture. He decides that we need to bring a balance of the two, because the masculine, the linear, the logical, I think of in terms of computers and technology, and that has brought us a long way. The feminine, the more organic, the natural, we need to bring that back in and create a balance. So it's not about one outweighing the other, it's about a balance. When I do my work, I want to bring you into the body. So this is how I began. This is done maybe 3 years ago, and I'm looking at the body as parts, body parts. And I knew somebody that was going through medical school. I knew somebody that was studying pharmacy. She was in pharmacy school, and they sit and draw each organ of the body. So I decided to do that. And I used to think of myself as parts that make up the whole. And after this series and progressing with it, I'm thinking each part contains the whole. And I'm no longer parts. I'm a complete whole. I designed a map. I was in an art exhibit and designed a map. That was the idea, that all the artists invited design a map. I created a map of Phoenix. And I likened the city to a cell, a living organism. And you know, the legend in the maps, the symbols mean something. So I really had to understand what a legend was, and I had to create one. So I take apart the city, and I connect it to a cell. The city of Phoenix becomes a living organism, and I break down all the parts. And even in the process of how I'm doing this, I'm coming to my studio in a very organic manner. Not really sure what I'm going to do, but I'm working. And then I'm bringing in this setup of information. Well, that little lower portion in the right-hand corner, that wasn't initially part of the legend. I put that in at the very end. And I make a connection. So the city is a cell, the state is an organ. Organs connected are like the United States, and then I am like the earth. So that was my setup to move forward. A self-portrait. And if you look at this, there's masculine and feminine qualities in it. You see the brain for the rational and the body for the feminine. This is a picture of my niece, and I make a body-mind connection in this too by learning the vagus nerve. So the little setup on the right is the vagus nerve. There's tissues, and she's 11 years old, so I'm really thinking about an 11-year-old. And this is just a detail of that image. I put the detail in there because I really want you to understand that I'm looking for something deeper than that. I'm looking for life. This is an image of my mother, and everything on this tells you her story. It's like a map of her story. So I'm looking at, she's got diabetes, pancreas is out. What does diabetes affect? The pancreas, the kidneys. So this really is a setup of things like genetics, what's genetic, what's environmental. Again, here's a detail. And I'm looking for more than all of that. I think I'm looking for spirit, I'm looking for life. I'm looking and I'm looking. And then I do these small little animal studies. I have a bee, a butterfly, and a bat. And these 3 living organisms are disappearing from our planet, and we need to ask ourselves why. So I come back to myself, stepping into my body, and I leave you with the questions: who are you? What is this earth? And what is your relationship to it? And I invite you to step into your body and make a connection to everything around you. I am a living organism, and I'm surrounded by living organisms, and the planet is a living organism. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Next, we have Flora Mace, who joins us from Seattle, Washington. Wonderful name for this panel, Flora, where she preserves botanicals in clear glass. Her technically complex process allows us to see, but not smell, the collected flowers from violets to narcissus. These forms recall Victorian floral displays and naturalist specimens, and challenge reductive modernist cubes.
Hi there. I wanted to first start off with a statement that 35 years ago, I was teaching glass blowing at Pilchuck Glass School. And after 3 weeks of glass blowing, I lost my voice. So I couldn't give the slide lecture. So my very good friend and colleague, Joey Kirkpatrick, who I've worked with for 35 years, gave the lecture and said, "You best sit down, I'm taking over." And so I wish I could use her today. She's in the audience, and she's the one that's helped me for the last 35 years become a better artist. And I really appreciate that, Joey. I'm going to start off with this. I love the woods. When I first came to Crystal Bridges here, I spent most of my time out in the woods here. The beautiful, beautiful trees. These are trees in the Northwest. These are big cedars. But art and nature are siblings, branches of the same tree, and nowhere more than the continuing inexplicability of many of their processes, and these processes involve science. And this is in the book The Tree by John Fowles. I think that I came upon bringing nature into the studio. I live in Seattle. And with Joey's help, Joey's a two-dimensional artist, and we started working together. And she would draw images on paper and say, "I want to do this." And I said, "Do you think about gravity? Do you think about shipping? Do you think about what we're trying to say?" And over the years, I've been able to figure out these pieces. This particular piece is called Round of Years. This is another work that we did. These are all native alder trees that we find in the Northwest. This piece is called Wooded Hollow. And you might notice there's fruit is a symbol within these, in the juxtaposition of man and nature. Women early on were only able to paint flowers and fruit. And since I'm a glass blower, I thought this would be a great homage to women. These fruits are, that's not a baby chair, that is a full-size chair. This bowl is 5 feet across. Each fruit is proportionate. That pear is over 3 feet tall. Joey, being a painter, figured out how to use crushed glass powders to create a three-dimensional object using the reflection and refraction of glass to create these fruits. And the peach really does look like it has peach fuzz. This piece, we decided every soil bears not everything. And this is so true in life. You can't grow certain plants or do certain things in certain soils. We've worked with two-dimensional and three-dimensional pieces. All of our big sculptures have steel inside the wood, easy for shipping. And with that knowledge, we have gone on to do field guides, and I'm really happy to see the Audubon series that is in the one of the main galleries. We spent 3 years doing crushed glass powder drawings, and these are pickups. These are not paintings. These are like pushing sand around and then picking up the powders. We did 90 of these in 3 years. This is our American project. You know, women started the field guide. Field guides were started in the United States so we wouldn't kill so many birds. And this is just a cross collection of those. Our next series was the flower series. And these are blown glass vessels with their names on them, Indian paintbrush. And this is what started our series that I really went off. We started collecting specimens ourselves and drawing them. And I was totally perplexed that the specimens we collected turned brown and brittle. And Joey was doing these beautiful flower drawings. And I went to places to see if I could find specimens, and unless you're a botanist, you can't get into the botanical centers to do research. And they said because your breath and your handling of the materials will destroy the materials. And so I decided that looking at nature, they look very different from the brown and brittle ones that have been done since Columbus came to America. So I went about a 6-year quest to see if I could figure out how to do this. All of the plant, this is a lady, Pterillium. These are encased in composite and glass mixture. When I started, I didn't know the direction I was going to go. I take all the plants apart. We've all dried plants. You put them in books, you use cornmeal, silica sand. I've found that using otolithic sand, which is the otolith or the sand that is in the Great Salt Lake, and basically it's brine shrimp eggs from millions of years that are coated with salt. It looks just like beach sand. I make these really fancy paper things, and that's a daffodil. I take them all apart. Sometimes I put wire inside. These are real botanicals. I grew up very close to Boston, and I went to see the Harvard flowers once, and I said, God, being a glassblower, I would love to tackle this. But I had such respect for the Balashkas. He didn't start the flowers till he was 65. I'm 65. I'm starting the flowers too. So I hope I do as well as Balashka did over his career. And I wanted you to know how science and art go together. You notice the tweezers. This is a plant that I'm putting back together, and I'm just casing. This is a wildflower from Washington. It's called a checkered lily. This is in the show downstairs. I'm putting one back together again. This is also a wildflower of Washington. This is the iris. I sent one of these botanicals, a very small one, to Kew Gardens. And a friend of mine said, Kew Gardens in London is the largest herbarium in the world. They have species from all over the world. And they looked at this and they said, you know, if this really works out, you're going to be putting a lot of our employees out of work. Because they still have a full-time painting staff that paint portraits of flowers year in and year out. Pansies. I have to go out into the wild, at least that's what I like to do. And this is on my property on the Olympic Peninsula. And this is a twin flower, Linnaeus borealis. And I have about an acre of them. And of course, you only see them for about 2 weeks. And if you ever came, you'd say, where are those flowers? Most of you that have flowers in your yard, I think the phrase is, God, you should have been here last week when they were all in bloom. This is a tizetta, and this is the tizetta that's downstairs along with the other one. When the crew from Crystal Bridges came to my studio after 6 years of experimentation, I still did not have a finished product. They looked at our studio and looked at all the work that we had done. And over in the corner was this piece laying on the table, and they said, what's that? And I said, well, you know, this is what I'm working on. I'm not really sure. My goal was to create a body of work with 3-dimensional plants that were in full color, that would withstand the test of time with their genetic material and their color. As far as I know, there is no place in the world that has any specimens that are not made out of glass, which the Harvard flowers are, which are fabulous replicas of species, or wax prototypes and paintings. So that's what we're working on now, and you should realize I can't do these alone. They are absolutely meticulous. Everything has to be taken apart and putting back together. So thank you very much, and I want to thank the museum for coming to my studio and giving me an opportunity to show what I'm working on. Thank you.
I'm mystified by your process. I think I need to see it actually happening. Next, we have Dornith Doherty, who comes here from South Lake, Texas, who takes X-ray photographs to explore, as she explains, the interstices of visual poetry and cold hard effects. Allowing you to see more than you can see with the naked eye, her images magnify specimens culled from her seed bank research. They challenge us to consider ecological scale and our human role in the survival of species large and small. Dornith.
Well, thanks to everybody at Crystal Bridges for organizing this symposium. I don't know about y'all, but I am fascinated to see everybody's processes and what they're working on. It's just been fantastic. And of course, thank you, Chad, for including me in the exhibition. I'm really honored by that. So spurred by the impending opening of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in 2008, I initiated a project called Archiving Eden. And I was inspired to make this project because of the simultaneously pessimistic and optimistic nature of Svalbard. On one hand, you have scientists and governments from around the world collaborating to create the first truly global botanical backup system, which is located in this cave that you can see in the middle of, way above the Arctic Circle. And on the other hand, the gravity of climate change and political instability has created the need for a doomsday vault near the North Pole. Seed banks conserve seeds or plants, usually clones when they're plants, and then freeze them in order to keep the material from changing further. This is a photograph of the smallest seeds in the world that I made in Australia. They're a type of orchid seeds, which is an interesting connection to one of the earlier talks. I'm struck by the power of these tiny seeds, and you can see here that they're smaller than a grain of sand, to generate life and to withstand the time span central to the process of seed banking, which seeks to make these sparks last for 200 years or more. The size and condition of the seed banks and the various collections are not necessarily a reflection of the botanical biodiversity that you can find in any country, but rather a reflection of the resources that are devoted to this effort. And the complex issues surrounding large-scale collections of seeds and plants relate to control of the world's basic resources, as these collections may be used to restrict or augment food supplies, serve as the material for research on plant-based industrial products, or reintroduce species due to climate change. And this is, it's hard to see. I'm sorry that we're having a little bit of a light problem on the slides, but this is the U.S. collection of genetic biodiversity of apples up in Geneva, New York. This project is twofold. Documentary photographs trace in precise detail the spaces and technology involved in seed banking in over 4 continents so far, and large-scale digital collages created from X-rays captured with each seed bank's own research equipment of living materials stored in these crucial collections. The extraordinary visual power of X-rays allows me to record what is invisible to human vision, and I use the X-rays to create digital collages that are abstract, metaphoric, and more openly poetic, while still maintaining the photographic detail. These libraries of life are teeming with fertile and diverse life forms in a state of suspended animation. So I make lenticular photographs that change color when you move past them, kind of like a hologram. The tension between stillness and change when viewing the prints reflect my focus on the elusive goal of stopping time and living materials, which at one point we would all like to do. And the piece that's in the state-of-the-art exhibition here in the North Gallery is also a lenticular photograph, so you can actually see that. Sometimes I try to do videos, but I decided since we had one that might be a reason to go take a look at it. using 66 different x-rays of the range of biodiversity found in corn to create this collage, I was inspired by the architecture of the archive and the corn researcher I worked with in the U.S. National Bank. The poetic questions about life and time on a macro and micro scale haunt me, and the collages, although abstract, are inspired by these questions. I had an opportunity to work in Australia, and the tiny space in which one whole species may exist may be a meter by a meter. They little tiny spaces, and every single living specimen of that plant lives in that spot on the planet. And you know, it reminds me that even though we think that life here is infinite, it's in fact finite. The interconnectedness of species living in one small plot with its reproductive vigor, and the visual resemblance between a seed pod and the vault architecture are related to these large pieces, one of which is on view here at the state-of-the-art exhibition. So the Millennium Seed Bank research seedlings and Lochner Steppe test garden, they were made on site in England, and they're all the biodiversity, a representative sample of the biodiversity in England, where they've collected almost 95% of their living plant species. These cross-sections are from the Wallamai pine, which thrived at the time of the dinosaurs and was thought to be extinct until a remnant population of living trees was found in a remote valley. And there are over 1,400 seed banks in the world, which exchange not only research, but also the seeds themselves. The use of the color Delft or indigo blue evokes references not only to the process of cryogenic preservation, central to the methodology of saving seeds, but also to the intersection of East and West, trade, cultural exchange, and migration. I've worked at the various institutions around the world, and each bank has stories of close calls and species surviving against the odds. In this era of climate change and extinction, those unexpected successes give me hope. This network of individuals, from scientists to volunteers, working in remote centers, sometimes without adequate resources, is crucial. And although we can't predict what the future will bring, the effects of individuals, when compiled, can make a collective change. And even one small act, when seen over 200 years, can change the trajectory of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dornith. Finally, we have Susan Campbell joining us from Ferndale, Michigan, who considers the role of the consumer in nature. She says, I look at nature, culture, and the process of change as one organic, continuous, dynamic force. Growing sod in post-consumer packaging, she employs the engineered landscape in making the familiar shapes of goods and their containers into bizarre, uncanny forms.
Thank you. I had a little change of plans, and I'm going to talk about my work dealing with sod when we meet in the gallery. And instead, I wanted to talk about a project called Portraits of Air that relates to my work with the ground and then with the air. And I want to start with a quote. In his book, Landscape and Western Art, Malcolm Andrews says, the experience of nature as process rather than picture depends on shifting the emphasis from landscape to environment. Landscape is an exercise of control from a relatively detached viewpoint. Environment implies a mutually effective relationship between the organism and its environing current field of significance. My local landscape is home to the auto industry, And Andrew's quote really resonates with me and gets to the core of my creative practice. One question that has driven my work over time is how can I engage the viewer to focus on the specifics of landscape while simultaneously alluding to a larger cultural or environmental field? So what you're looking at up there is a video I created in 2009. I received a generous fellowship to launch several projects that focused on air, and that's what I want to focus on in this brief few minutes. So the video is an excerpt from this year-long project where I recorded the weather in Detroit from a webcam placed on the 22nd floor of a building that overlooked the Detroit skyline. The camera was aimed alternately at 3 different views of the city. What you just saw was a view of downtown Detroit. And the camera took a still image every second, 24 hours a day for 1 year. So when I let's see if I can go back. When I created the video, I compressed it to run at 22 frames per second. Whoops, there we go. So what you're seeing is a whole bunch of still images that are compressed, and what this did was allow me to see weather patterns moving in over the city. And as I worked on this project, the entire video is 3 hours long. I noticed certain nuances with the clouds, so I consulted meteorologists and I asked them what's going on here, and they were equally as excited to see, this effect of a cumulus cloud, which is what happens when you have heat and torque from emissions from smokestacks. So the big cloud on the right is from the Ford Rouge plant, and the cloud on the left in the lower image is from a steel smelter on Zug Island. And the coloration in the sky is also of interest to me. So all of these things have become the focal point for many of my projects. This view is from Southwest Detroit. And after looking at this and after creating the video, I decided I wanted to push my question further about how do you get people to pay attention to their local landscape. In 2010, I devised 2 projects, 2 public art projects around the concept of air. For the first project, I worked with a graphic designer to create a tourist brochure called Cloud Spotting Detroit. My intent was to get people to look at the local environment in Detroit as it existed and without judgment. I placed the brochure at various locations around the city, including hotels and B&Bs. Of course, it had to complete with other activities like golf. I also placed it at a bike rental facility along the river, which hosts bike tours. And in 2011, I led my first cloud spotting bike tour. Here's the brochure. The brochure had a scientific key for cloud identification, and it included 5 types of man-made clouds. Some of the categories include savory clouds, from some of the best barbecue in the city, a section on historic clouds of dust, which highlights where buildings once stood but have been imploded. It also highlights some of the best steam spots in the city where there are numerous steam leaks. And I look at these as opportunities. The warm, moist air is clean, so I put in where the best street spas may be. I actually got a friend of mine to pose in the middle of a major intersection in a towel in February for this brochure. Another category I had highlighted paintings in the Detroit Institute of Arts that have great depictions of clouds. This was from a section called Pungent Clouds. Notice I didn't say bad pollution, they're just pungent. The second project I launched in 2010 was a crowdsourced project called Dirty Pictures, Portraits of Air. After shadowing an air monitoring technician for the state of Michigan for several months to learn how air quality is measured, I revisited my question of how to get people to think of their local environment as being connected to the broader global environment. For this project, I distributed 8x10 air filters to participants in 7 countries. I asked people to place the filter in a location where they thought the air was dirty. After a year's time, the filters were mailed back to me and exhibited. The project was documented in a poster-like zine. I think this goes back to Isabella's question about how do you portray air? It's kind of tough. Since 2010, I have launched 2 other air portrait projects. One focused on the 5 New York boroughs, and most recently, a project in Pittsburgh where I distributed 100 air filters at the Three Rivers Arts Festival, and they were later exhibited the following year at a gallery. I had a website devoted to the project and kept in touch with the 100 participants through email. It was very time-consuming. Even though the project focuses on particulate matter, the locations where people place their filters are the highlight of this project. I composed a poem called Air Moves based on the project and had it recorded by a poet reading as a sound piece. Here are some of the photos that people would send me of where they place their air filter, and I'll read you a few excerpts from the poem, which document all the locations. Air moves on the south side of Pittsburgh, over the hood of the car, behind the bus, in the tunnel, across the street from the amusement park, near the steel mill, into the leaky garage with concrete and metal dust, around the Coke plant, near the nativity set, in the tiny cramped studio by the kitchen window, at the Bluebird kitchen on either side of the cooking line next to the fryer and the gas range, inside the freight elevator at the dance studio, by the front door during the polar vortex, in rough weather, in high winds, air moves. One place, then another, off Tuscarawas Road to New York, near the approach to the Midtown Tunnel, to Bed-Stuy on top of the bread box at the Green Gourmet Market, to the fire escape after Hurricane Irene, in the studio in Imatra, Finland, to the rafters of the kitchen in Uganda with no ventilation, to under the 300-year-old oak in Roden, Germany. Air moves in October in Wei Fu Ying Street in Beijing for 1 hour. Here's a filter that was placed near the meat smoker at Slow's Barbecue in Detroit. These are just a few examples of how I use my work and creative practice to entertain questions and engage people with the physical world. Over time, I have found the less didactic my projects are, the more successfully they can engage with local populations. For me, creativity is energizing, and to move forward with the hefty environmental issues we face, the more important it is to keep people motivated. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So I think, okay. Did you want me to? So we're going to have about 15 minutes discussion with the panel now. And I thought I would just start off with a question, and then y'all can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And then we'll have time for audience questions. I was really interested, Susan, in your distinction that you were making between landscape and environment. So often in my classes, I tried to talk to students about the difference between landscape and land, just this concept that there is this material thing out there. And historically, in art history anyway, landscape has been that an aesthetic category that was taught to people, how you see that out there within a frame, whether it be the sublime or the picturesque or this kind of quality of the beautiful. And I was also thinking about when you were in conjunction with this, when you were showing your photograph of the clouds, Bill McKibben's, the environmental writer, his book, The End of Nature, in which he addresses shifting notions of beauty. And he kind of poses the question to say, what happens when aesthetic categories like beauty change? For instance, when a brilliant sunset we see no longer results from a confluence of bright sunlight and high clouds, but instead smog. And that has always really struck me in powerful ways because, art historians, especially contemporary critics, don't talk that much about beauty, but the fact is things are beautiful in the world, including art. And it does kind of puzzle me about, I'm using very old notions to talk about these really new concepts, and what we're seeing out there, a sunset today or clouds today aren't the same as they were 50 years ago. And do you think about that in your work? How do you deal with that? Anyone, yeah. But Susan, yeah.
I can say yes. Can you hear me? Okay, yes. You really hit it for me because that coloration in the sky is what drew me into the whole air quality issue. And my work has always used beauty to pull myself in or the viewer in because it's a double-edged coin. Beauty it can be horrific and stunning simultaneously. So my work has always stemmed from that. I make many kinds of work, and my earlier works are depictions literally of atmosphere and stacks and things like, but they're rendered beautifully. So I'm very interested in the cultural sublime.
Want to respond or have any thoughts about those things? Or
is this working? It makes me think of, I don't know if you guys know what's happening down in the Southwest in Phoenix, Arizona, and in Tucson. There's these dust storms that we have. In the last few years, they've been pretty incredible. It's not a good thing, but they're incredible to watch. Really incredible, and that's what it makes me think of. Yeah, everybody's out there with their cameras, but what's really going on, and we really don't know.
Yeah. Isn't that brought on by the severe drought in that part of the country?
Well, it's a combination of things, but I don't think that they really understand what's happening. There's a lot of construction going on, and the loosening of gravel and the loosening of dirt, so there's a number of things that are happening.
I was also thinking about writer Rebecca Solnit, as all of you were talking, whose many, many books I love, but as Eve said to the serpent, she says, the desire to know is as often motivated by love as hate. And I always think about that quotation in relationship to Foucault's work, who said, the French philosopher, essentially saying he's motivated by curiosity, not the curiosity that seeks to assimilate what is proper for one to know, but that which enables one to get free of oneself. And all of your work and the work of artists and scientists, I think, in general, rely on an incredibly driven, curious mind. But as you all pointed out, what you discover and find out on the other side, it is this, you're finding out a lot of the marvelous and wondrous things about nature that natural historians, for instance, have always found, but also everything else that comes along with those discoveries, which is loss or, So I wonder if you can kind of speak to that.
The first 10 years of my work dealt almost exclusively with loss and extinction and rarefication. So even though I was depicting things in this very sort of luscious and beautiful way, it was all really dark news. And I got some flack for that, but So I don't know what to say, except that I was really happy to work on the novos, things that were new because they'd recently been found. But the more I learned about species that had just been found, as I investigated more, I figured out that 90% of them were endangered too, even though they'd just been found. So I think this is a sort of a very modern dilemma that we just see a lot of the dark. That's all. We're experiencing a lot of fear and loss. We're in that kind of time. Maybe we've always been in that kind of time. Who knows?
So I guess this ties into kind of ecology and sustainability, which is a very big part of all academic and public discourse right now. And I kind of wonder what you all see the role of the artist being, if you envision yourself as specifically being a kind of socially conscious artist responding to ecological crisis, or do you see yourself as someone who is representing nature? Yeah.
I think it's really important to realize that the younger generation of today is involved in many computer tweets, Facebook, and I really worry about what's happening with their instantaneous opportunities because most science, painting, sculpture is a long process. So it'll be interesting to see in their generation how the arts and the vulnerabilities within those arts change.
One of the things that I thought about when I was putting my presentation together is that, I showed the little, and I moved through them really quickly, the bee and the monarch butterfly and the bat. And when I was doing my research, I'm looking at images, scientific studies. I'm looking at photographs and anatomy study. But I also went back into art history, and I looked at Egyptian papyrus images of bees and butterflies. And I went into Mayan art and Aztec art to look at the bat, and there's wonderful images. And I'm thinking of myself in the 21st century and my renderings and my studies. And my hope is that, I thought, well, I hope that bees and butterflies and bats are still here for the next 200, 300 years. But the truth is, I hope that they're still here in 20 years, and that artists are drawing them because they know them, and that we can still pull them from history. And so as an artist, I see myself as a recorder, but we've been recording for a long time, and my hope is that we can continue to record because they exist. That's my hope.
Well, and it's interesting because, there's a theme that runs through many of what we're doing, which is, we're not confusing ourselves with scientists. We're not scientists. We work with scientists, so we know what they're doing and how what we're doing is different. But we do bring to light things that may be inaccessible to, there's a certain amount of kind of privileged access that we are sharing. And then also this notion of preserving things like what you said about being able to see what the color of this actual plant and preserving the DNA as the basis for an herbarium. That was a really interesting idea. Or the fact that you're showing these new animals that no one's ever seen, and they may disappear before anybody gets to see them. So that there's this moment, or like what I'm doing with the seed bank, where in the documentary project, I'm showing the inside of these inaccessible fortresses that they're building. So that notion of bringing that conversation to light so that people engage with it in this kind of non-didactic, non-lecturing, but there's this moment where there's a spark of curiosity that makes people want to know more.
So I like so many things of what you all just said. I love that what Flora said about kind of slowing people down, because Isabella was talking about that in the goal of her paintings. And the things that you were saying, Dornith, I was just thinking about, artists do have certain tools, and Mark Dion talks about this in his work, that scientists don't. They have access to things like irony, humor, comedy, right? These are things that are not the tools of scientists. And also, when you mentioned that there's a kind of access that you have in the kind of work that you do that the larger public might not have, I mean, that is something that in my own work I think about a lot with positivist kind of modern science, which is very different than, older natural history in many ways, or even natural history today, the way it's practiced, that the general public doesn't have access to science, and artists have the ability to visualize things and seem to attend to whole organism studies in ways that, my friends who are scientists, they deal with subatomic particles and molecules and things that we can't see, chromosomes and genes, and so many of you are dealing with whole organism study, which is really fascinating.
Taxonomy is kind of a dying science. But I am really encouraged. You were talking about fear that these new technologies would somehow take away from this. And actually, I think they're adding a tremendous amount. A friend of mine's an ant scientist, ant specialist, and some young people at Google contacted him, or he contacted them, and now you can go on Google Ant and identify an ant anywhere in the world because they've connected Google Maps to Google Ant. To the Ant Web and Google Earth. So I'm actually very much encouraged about this kind of cross-generational, cross-sharing, cross-science sharing.
I want to second that. I have gone around whenever I'm traveling and photographed weather balloon launches. And I was in Brussels a couple of years ago, and weather balloons are launched based on the Greenwich clock. So I get to the Royal Meteorological Institute, and I meet this scientist, and he wound up telling me about a fantastic project in London that was called 12 O'Clock in London that he was participating in. And I have had such incredible interchanges with scientists that I believe there's so much crossover now, and they're very open to the edge is really shifting. And I read an article in the Times a couple years ago. The article was called "Watching the Whales Watch Us." And there was a point that was made about that scientists are becoming better storytellers. And I really loved that, because my experience of working with scientists has been of that, along those lines.
I want to say something too. We're talking about scientists, but I want to get right back to the basics of it. I think every one of you in the audience has something to give to every one of us. And I know that, we talk about plants mutating and hybridizing and animals doing all this. Just by coming to this symposium, I have also changed. By hearing these other talks by the other artists here and meeting many of you and where you've come from and the things you've grown. And I think by people getting together and sharing, you don't have to be a scientist, you just have to be giving.
Well
I think
said.
that's an awesome segue into question and answer. Yes.
Let's see. We'll give you the mic.
Okay, I heard a strand in almost everybody's presentation about, oh, it's not didactic, oh, it's not politics, all that stuff doesn't work, a lecture is yuck. Could you elaborate on what's wrong with a good talk, with a good lecture?
Well, guess by what I was trying to say was saying that sometimes rather than telling people what they should think, that you should ask them a question that engages them. That was my point.
And I'm hoping that all of our works stimulate something in you that you can then go on to your own creative force. I think it gives great hope to a lot of young artists about seeing some of the very basic things that all of us have done to get our projects going. I just got excited about a plant, and look where it took me.
And I actually had a slide that showed all the institutions that I've given use of my images to, so it actually is quite purposefully political, and I don't see anything wrong with that.
And I used the word didactic because I bring a lot of I work with people and they pose the question. You know, I try to bring about a creative investigation or facilitate a situation where people can say, I wonder if the air is dirty here, or I wonder what happens here. And it gets a conversation going without saying, do you know there's a steel smelter and there's this much lead in the air? So it really keeps the conversation going and people motivated, is my experience.
And then just to step into the experience for what it is, and not decide one thing or the other. And I think of just stepping into myself. How does my body feel? Not comparing, just stepping into what is real.
A question over here.
So basically, a lot of the lectures are based on one directions of information. You tapped into science to say better illustrate something or something you're interested in. So I'm curious about it as opposed to a monologue, as a dialogue. What do you feel science has gained from your experiencing artists with you rather than like, oh, hey, I know how this plant looks. Like, how has it changed the scientists you work with?
I have one example. The nudibranchs that are so brilliantly colored, they don't have eyes, they don't see. There's some documented mimicries that are happening with them, but just because I don't have their training, I've come up with a couple of theories that may be applicable that they might not have thought of. And because I talk to scientists in different disciplines, I don't work with only ornithologists or only herpetologists. So there's a theory with some moth folks that moth antennae are just the right distance apart to see in the infrared. And I posited that to a nudibranch specialist who thought, oh, so you don't know what your innocent questions are bringing about in the minds of someone in a very different discipline. So I just keep throwing ideas out, and maybe some of them will be something. Who knows?
For me, I ran into a plant pathologist. He's the guy that figures out what's wrong with your rose bush or what kind of bugs are on your plant. And he was so I was actually quite upset. I had realized that I put like a rose. It is not in the exhibition, but there was a rose petal that had, some bacteria on it, and it looked, we're all spraying for those things. And he said, oh, I'm so excited. You can see that in 3D, and you can see how the roots are affected and how this is affected. And he said, it's really hard to explain that to students, what it looks like. So it really got him excited, and then he got me excited, and the idea of the Kew Garden saying, well, we love what you're doing, but we can't get to the DNA of your plant. And then they posed to me, we're using these great microscopes, but if you use green glass, you're tinting the color that we're looking at. So they're giving information back to me, and I'm going, oh, how can I get better glass? And then I ran into a chemist from Corning Glass Museum that said, oh, we're making all the new glass for all the new iPhones. You've heard of that, haven't you? So each scientist and artist bat things back and forth. I think that's what's really wonderful about the art world. Hopefully we're not afraid to show each other what we're doing and the influences that we've been exposed to that will help us grow, and then it stimulates the next person. I mean, I'm really honored to be up here on this panel with these artists. They've given me so much hope about so many new directions.
I mentioned that the meteorologist that I worked with was so excited to see the footage of a cumulus cloud. He had not seen that in actuality, but he described it perfectly analytically what was happening, and to see it, within the geographic area that he was working that was amazing. So, and I like to also second that it's been so incredible to learn about each other's work, and that's something that has come out of this whole exhibit, and
Yeah.
especially today. Thank you.
Fumulus cloud?
Fumulus is, fumulus, yeah. It's like, so it's really caused by, humans, fumes, right. And it's almost like if you think of a classic ballet dancer when they're turning on one leg, that spin would just hold it in place. There's a cloud that forms naturally over mountains called lenticular clouds, and it's all based on atmospheric conditions that clouds are held in place, and they look like spaceships. So, my whole thing is that you can't separate all these things out. We are part of nature, and so I look at it as just all one big soup. It's we can't. Yeah.
How would you differentiate that between like a smokestack and then a cloud? How did a cloud occur?
That's a
from-
great question, because I try not to differentiate them.
Okay.
So that whole guide that I did was intended to put all of the man-made clouds into one category. I still use a scientific key that identifies, the clouds that have been classified into the 7 categories. But I added man-made clouds. So my goal is to get people to look at everything as all one, not separate that's natural, that's artificial. So that guide looks at all the clouds, man-made or natural.
Any other questions? Oh, Chad's like, I'm ready.
Hey, y'all. So there was an interesting thread that I saw running through some of this work, and it has to do with evidence. So evidence supporting some kind of thesis, and that's important in science, right? Scientists often point to evidence to prove or disprove what some kind of hypothesis. Now, when you look at several of your work, you're making representations of other things. Susan, your portraits of air are actual, that's physical stuff, right? But Flora, those flowers are flowers, right? That's not a representation of a flower. It's not an image that you've made of the flower. It is the thing itself. And I wonder if you could talk through that. Do you think of them as images? Do you think of them as specimens, or are they somewhere in between?
I think of them as images, and I think of them as specimens. I'm coming at it two different ways. One is that there's some beautiful paintings in the galleries of flowers. And to capture the essence of the beauty of that flower is incredible with paint. And to realize that here we are in the 21st century, and the real plant does not exist for us to see except for maybe a week. And so I felt like if I can get someone to look at the plants that I've captured to create some awe or energy that they should save some of their plants or look at them more closely or document the time when they bloom, I take every petal, every root stock off because they all dry at different points, and I need to capture the plant when it's in full bloom and not lose its chlorophyll. And then put them all back together. Like many of the artists up here, they're reassembling or assembling through paint or photographs. I'm reassembling my image. I'm trying to create the best image of that particular plant that ever existed. So it didn't exist exactly that way in nature. I am reassembling that the same as a painter would visually through paper and pencil or paint reassemble that image. But it really, I'm in hopes that everybody has a special plant in their garden that they want to save and document the time period that that thing bloomed, so maybe we can make contact someday.
Flora, do you use one flower, or do you have to use parts from many flowers sometimes to get a whole?
I wish that I had the opportunity to have 4 flowers, one to look at, one to photograph, one to put in the sand, and one in cold storage that I can take out to make sure that it looks exactly like it was before. But many times I will photograph the original. You know, I'll hold on to it, and actually Joey will photograph it. Now, then we'll draw out what we think is important within that composition and try to assimilate a beautiful object. Really, I want you to look at it and go, God, how, I mean, that 7-second rule, I mean, there's an artist that said, God, if you can get someone to look at your thing, 7 seconds, that's a really long time. And if it means you trying to figure out how I did that for 7 seconds, thank you very much. I went through 6 years of not knowing whether I would ever figure it out. And I'm really hoping that I have some that are 4 years old that have held their color and form, and I'm amazed myself, so.
Other questions? I just want to be an art critical pain in the butt and just say that I'm not convinced it's a real flower. I'm writing about Mark Dian's bear in Norway right now, and it's not actually a real bear. It's not even a real taxidermic bear. It's a stuffed animal, but I'm kind of making the argument that it's more real than a lot of actual bears walking around out in the world. So, you know, I mean, this gets back to kind of like even Duchamp's urinal, right? Like, is it a urinal anymore, or is it an artwork? Like, once we take it out of its context, it's something else. So, anyway.
You know, the original was lost, right?
Right.
And there are 6 of them in museums as the original.
Weren't we just talking about Baudrillard and the simulacra, right?